happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Hello, and welcome to episode 46 of Occupy TV. I'm Joe Tyndall, and I have with me today Charlie Swanson. And we're getting close to the big 5-0. And we got another one to do today and a couple on the weekend. We might actually make it by Sunday. So welcome to the show.
Thanks.
And I guess Charlie's been spending a fair amount of time with the Eugene City Council, convincing them that they should put a ballot question on, and apparently they agreed with him. So what's the question say?
So it's an advisory question on corporate, union, constitutional rights, and campaign spending. The question itself is, shall Congress send to states constitutional amendment reversing negative impact of the Citizens United case and limit independent campaign spending? Okay. It's very closely related to a resolution that the City Council passed in February of this year, and we felt that it was useful for voters to get a chance to have their say on the question and not just leave it with the City Council saying they would like Congress to do this.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested in how you got them to put the word negative in there, because that kind of implies that they should vote, vote for the question because it's already built into the statement of the question.
The wording of the question itself was actually done primarily by Councilor Zelenka. Yeah. We had made a proposal. The City Council referred further writing of the proposal to the city attorney. He wrote something, and neither of them quite said what we thought it should say. Common Cause also weighed in with some things that they thought the question should say, and Zelenka kind of put all those notions together and came up with this wording. Now, one of the things that happens on this is it can only be 20 words in the question. It's limited by law to 20 words, and it's hard to say exactly what you want in 20 words. We think this did a pretty good job of saying something in 20 words.
So let's talk. What is Citizens United? I mean, we've talked about this before on the program, but there's probably some new listeners. So what is Citizens United?
So Citizens United was a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2010, which was about a group which was called Citizens United, and they wanted to affect the election, and it was essentially the election of Hillary Clinton. They had produced a very negative video, fairly long video about Hillary Clinton, and there were laws, I think it was Massachusetts, where they were trying to present this, and there were laws in that state which prohibited an organization, a corporation. They were a nonprofit corporation, and a corporation nonetheless. It prohibited them from putting out things that were either for or against a candidate within 60 days of the election. And so they challenged that. And they put forth a lot of arguments why they should be allowed to do this. And actually, I agreed with them that they should have been allowed to do this. But the Supreme Court went way beyond just saying that they should be allowed to do this. The Supreme Court said, oh, well, even though nobody in previous arguments before courts had brought up some of these questions, we want to rule much more broadly than what you're arguing for. The prosecutor, or the people arguing for the case, had never brought up the broad questions that the Supreme Court decided they wanted to consider. And so they very much broadened the issue and said, oh, we're going to make this about independent campaign spending overall. And we're going to say that corporations and unions and other artificial entities, and individuals also, should have no limits whatsoever on how much they can spend on independent campaigns. And there were a couple reasons for this. One of the reasons was that that corporations, or I guess the independent campaigns did not allow the possibility of corruption. That's what the claim was in the decision. The other reasoning they said, contrary to a popular belief that this was about corporations having the right to free speech, which it kind of was, the court actually backed into that and said, people have the right to listen to arguments no matter who they come from. Even if they come from corporations, you should be able to listen to those, and nobody should be able to put any limitations whatsoever on what you can listen to. Even though, of course, one might expect corporate executives had enough money, they could have put this on the ballot, they could have put forward these things themselves. They did not have to rely on the corporate general fund, which isn't even theirs to spend, really.
Right. But, so I guess what it did was it opened up the floodgates for money in the elections, which sort of changed things from one person, one vote to $1, one vote type thing?
Yes, especially to the extent that advertising works. Now, it's not quite $1, one vote. If it were, there would be no question. They would win every time. There would be no chance whatsoever that the 99% could ever beat the 1%. But advertising does work pretty well. It certainly can't convince everybody about what's going on, but it works well enough that it can convince enough voters to most of the time sway elections. So elections can turn on the amount of money that's spent, even though it isn't quite $1, one vote, but it's somewhat like that.
Well, I mean, I've seen numbers, I don't remember the exact figures, that the person, for example, for congressional offices, Congress and the House and Senate, that the person with the who spends the most money wins the election some ungodly percentage of the time, like 97 or 98% of the time?
Yeah, I don't know the percentages right off, but it is very high. And it's true for ballot measures too. Generally, the group that spends the most money on a ballot measure will win that election.
Yeah, because it doesn't even have to be true. I mean, the information that's being put out, I mean, the whole Swift voting thing with Kerry was a good example of sort of an extreme attack piece that was extremely successful, but not based in fact.
Yes, and there's another. Max Cleland is another example. I mean, you have war heroes that were declared by the fanatic right-wing militarists that they were unpatriotic because they didn't want to spend quite as much money as their opponents on defense. Right. And so even with war heroes, they got put in the group of unpatriotic.
Yeah. So in other words, if we spend more than everyone else on the planet put together, that's not enough.
Yeah, that's generally the argument that's put forward by essentially the corporatists, because most of this money that's spent goes into their hands. And so they can get a large percentage of that money that's spent, and they don't want to lose that. Yes, and so even though we spend pretty much more than the rest of the planet, it's not quite enough.
Not enough. So absolute domination is the goal.
Yeah, absolute domination, and again, many of them are not so much interested in absolute military domination. They're interested in making vast quantities of money, and this is one of the ways that they can do so, is by a lot of spending on military, because most of that does go to very large corporations. We know that the servicemen and women don't get all that highly paid, and so we know that not all that much goes to them. And even though they do get pretty decent health care through the Veterans Administration, there's a lot of people who don't get the care they really need, and we don't really feel like we should spend many of the militarists don't feel like we should spend as much as we probably should for that purpose.
Yeah. So in other words, it's great to go over there, beat people up, take their stuff, get rich, but you know, if you have injured people coming back, forget about them. If they were better people, they wouldn't have got injured. Yeah,
that's somewhat the feeling of many of these corporatists, yes.
Okay, back to the question. So we have sort of the roots of this, I think, are basically in the whole corporate personhood thing, which if we go back, you know, to the beginning of civilization, we have a king who owns everything, or when civilization occurs and we actually have permanent settlements and surplus wealth, then we start having kings, lots of kings and lots of slaves. So a few kings and lots of slaves. And the process has gone on through, you know, throughout history, and periodically the working people beat the king back a little bit and get some rights. And so what was the whole attitude towards corporations like at the time of the U.S. Revolution?
So when the U.S. Revolution started, the largest corporation in the world was the British East India Company, and they basically controlled the colonies. The King of England and all of the House of Lords were shareholders in the British East India Company, and they gave certain people the monopoly, the right to govern, and they just sort of said, okay, you're going to govern, and it was as a corporation. You were a representative of the corporation. So all of the colonies initially were corporations. You know, the Massachusetts Bay Company, they were all corporations. The American Revolution was largely fought against the corporations, against the corporations of the colonies, the British East India Company as a whole.
Right.
In fact, the Boston Tea Party was a protest directly against lower taxes for the British East India Company. I mean, we often say taxation without representation. That was certainly part of the rallying cry. But the actual thing that forced the Tea Party to happen, or pushed the activists to protest, was that the British East India Company had lower taxes than anybody else, and so everybody else had to pay a certain amount of taxes, and it gave them a huge advantage. And many of the protesters were small businessmen who perhaps sold teas. They were merchants of some kind, or their friends, and they said, this isn't fair. And this huge corporation doesn't need to have such a government-given advantage.
So in other words, the king and his buddies, okay, wanted to have a higher profit on their corporation, so they changed the laws so that it paid less taxes.
Yeah, and part of it was that because the colonists were successful in some international trade and could actually get the tea there more cheaply, the British East India Company had a surplus that they needed to dump, basically. And so that was kind of the impetus for it.
So in other words, if the king can't win with the rules the way they are, the rules will be changed.
Yes, and of course, like you pointed out, it's not just the king. It was the king and his wealthy buddies.
Right.
And so, yeah, if they can't make enough money with the rules the way they are, they'll change the rules so they can.
Okay, so we had a revolution, and the word corporation never appears in the Constitution.
Yeah, that's correct. So never in the Constitution. In fact, the original Constitution, not the original, the Constitution that we know of now was pretty much a protection of property rights, but that didn't go over too well with people who had just fought in the revolution, so they've kind of forced the Bill of Rights to be put in there. And so the Bill of Rights really, we often think of it as giving rights to people. It really doesn't do that. It recognizes certain rights as inherent and inalienable. So we have, the rights that are in there are not considered to be given by that Constitution. They are just recognized by the Constitution.
Right. So in other words, it starts out, the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law, okay, which would interfere with these given rights. So very clear language. Very clear language.
And so to artificial entities like states and Congress and other groups of people like that, it gives certain powers and it gives obligations. And so there's certain powers and obligations they have. And anything that is not specifically stated in any power that is not specifically stated in the Constitution by I think it's the 9th Amendment, is given to the states or the people.
Right.
And so never is there any right given to an artificial entity. It's only acknowledged that people have rights.
Right. So let's talk for a little bit. One of the things you said, obligations in the Constitution, and there are some. For example, one is running a post office. The Constitution, specifically in the Constitution, and I believe it's Article 1, there is requirements for a national postal system. And have you been following the stuff recently about that? That apparently the post office just defaulted on a payment into their pension fund. that what's happened is not that the post office is failing or is badly managed, but in 2006, Congress inserted a poison pill. They said that the post office must fund 75 years of pension within the coming 10 years.
Yeah, so we have a number of people, leaders in our country, Congress people, who want to try to prove that the government is ineffective and inefficient. And so they try to make rules such that this is what happens. So that this entity, the post office, which is an obligation, yes, that's in the Constitution, can be shown to be inefficient and cannot manage to do this. So the intent is to privatize this. And they've been doing that with a number of different things that the government runs. For example, even the military. We have, I think, more people as private contractors in Afghanistan and Iraq than we do actually servicemen paid in the military. So there's a huge effort to privatize as many things as possible. Now, the notion is by the ultra-conservatives is that this is more efficient and more effective, but it almost never is, and the main reason they do that is because pay to people in the government is limited quite a bit. I mean, the highest you can get is what the president gets for federal government, say, and that's just not enough for them. It's just a pauper salary. It barely even gets you into the 1%. Mm-hmm. So that's way insufficient, and the only way that you can really get high salaries is to be in private companies.
Right. But again, there's profit-making opportunities in privatization of various services. I guess most of the construction and procurement, meals, those kinds of things were privatized in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And I have been looking for numbers. At one point some time back, I came across the figure that there were 150,000 contractors in Iraq. And my understanding was those were predominantly armed. But I haven't been able, since we've pulled out, the largest number that I've seen is about 15,000 still there, of which 5,000 are working at the U.S. Embassy. So I don't know whether there's more for private corporations that are there or what, but...
yeah, I don't know how much it is anymore. I don't know the real numbers. But at some point it was, well, I think if you combine Iraq and Afghanistan together, the number of private contractors is above the number of servicemen there.
Yeah, it probably is now.
Yeah.
But, and the contractors are not guys doing plumbing. The contractors are guys carrying guns.
Often, yes.
Yes. So, or at least the largest part of them. It's kind of a nice euphemism for people with guns, contractors. But back to the question. So the Eugene City Council thinks that we should be voting on this thing. So you got a couple of months to run a campaign. What's that going to look like?
We are not exactly sure all of the things we're going to do. We're going to try to get arguments in the voters pamphlet, and we're crafting arguments now, and I would like to actually bring forward some of those arguments a little bit later in this. But we also are intending to have some public meetings where we can get the word out. We're working on getting a program through the City Club. We're hoping that we can convince either Merkley or DeFazio to join us. Both of them have indicated some support for a constitutional amendment, so we would like them to come and be part of the discussion. So we could convince them to actually work for a stronger amendment. That's part of why we want to get them here. And we also figure that more people will listen, will come to an event and listen if they're part of the program. So we think that could be useful. We are intending to do some door-to-door, talk to as many people as we can. We're intending to talk to people at the Eugene celebration, perhaps, and other venues. We intend to try to get more information into papers in Eugene, the Register Guard and the Weekly. So we hope we can get more information about that. We're hoping we can convince people to talk who already know something about this to talk to their neighbors about it. So we're hoping we can have a pretty decent conversation among people. So there are really two pieces to the advisory question and to a lot of the things that are going on with this sort of a call for an amendment. I mean, the call for an amendment is actually nationwide. There's, I think, 120 communities around the nation so far that have called for an amendment. There's 6 states that have. Montana is going to vote on something. So the two pieces are, one is corporate constitutional rights, or often called just corporate personhood. So that's a big part of it. And a constitutional amendment to say that corporations don't have the rights that people have, I think, is extremely useful. And the other piece of it is campaign spending, where the Citizens United decision itself said that independent campaign spending should be unlimited, or it cannot be limited in any way, actually, so that the wealthy have a lot more power to get their voice heard than anybody else. With 400 families having the same wealth as half of the population of our country, it's pretty easy to see that it doesn't take very many extremely wealthy people to get their voice heard a lot more than half of our country. So those two things both are part of it. So let me go back to the corporate constitutional rights part of it first. Okay. As you mentioned earlier, the Constitution never mentions corporations in it. Our founders really did not like corporations. Jefferson has a famous warning about our corporations increasing their power so much that they're going to usurp the power of government soon. And so he has some famous warnings. He was very much against the power of corporations, as were most of our founders. And the Constitution makes it clear that they don't have any rights, that people have rights, they're inherent. These artificial entities have obligations. Early in the history of our country, incorporation was done by the states, it still is. It was always time limited. You could not form a corporation for more than 20 years or 40 years, depending upon the state. They were obligated to serve the public good. They had to write into their incorporation papers what public good they were serving. It was for a limited time. And that was the way it worked for quite some time.
And they couldn't own other corporations.
They couldn't own other corporations.
They could own property, but not other corporations.
Yes. And so very early, the Supreme Court found, if you want, the corporations in the Constitution. The earliest is Marbury versus Madison, which was in the 1800-something years. So they basically said, oh, these words must be intended to mean corporations. So they kind of found corporations in the Constitution. So the thing we have to remember is every time corporations get rights, what does that mean? So if they don't have rights, that means that people, municipalities, state governments have the power to regulate them, to control them in the way they see fit for the purpose of benefiting either the welfare or the health of their constituents, of the people in their community. If corporations have rights, that means that you can't interfere with that corporation. You, the state, you, the other person, you, the municipality, you, the federal government, cannot interfere with these things of the corporation. And so you cannot regulate them in a manner that might be helpful to the citizens.
So it's okay for corporations to dump their toxic waste?
Yeah. That actually is not a particular right that, that the Supreme Court has given them, unless they can phrase it in a certain way. So just directly, do they have the right to dump the toxic waste? No. They have rights to interstate commerce, and so if a municipality decides that you can't dump your toxic waste here, but it's a corporation that in any manner whatsoever can be considered interstate, and the federal government has made a law about this, then the municipality cannot make another law.
So they're preempted?
They're preempted, yes.
Yeah.
So it's not so much they have the right to dump the toxic waste, it's that under many circumstances, you as a municipality don't have the right to stop them from doing so.
Right.
So there's many instances of that nature. So again, anytime the corporation gets a right, it takes as a person, it takes the right of people away from regulating them with respect to that particular situation.
Okay. So, yeah, a lot of people talk about the Santa Clara thing, which was the first time that it was sort of explicitly said that a corporation was a person. It was kind of chipping away a little bit at a time.
Yeah.
You know, but then that was, I think that was what,
1886. So the 14th Amendment, which clearly was intended to give equal protection to people,
sort of to avoid the law that, for example, Florida did, where following the Civil War and the blacks were given the right to vote. So what Florida did was to pass a law that said if you were a felon you couldn't vote, and then promptly arrest every black man in the state and convict them of a felony.
Yeah. With the 50 years after the 14th Amendment was passed,
yeah,
there were a number of cases that got to the Supreme Court. I think 2 or 3 of them had to do with the rights of black people. Most of them, by far, had to do with the rights of corporations. And so there were lawyers and cases coming before the Supreme Court that for many years tried to argue that corporations had these rights. And it actually, they didn't win for quite a while. It took until 1886 before they actually won. And they actually didn't even win in the Santa Clara case. It was the court recorder, who was a former railroad executive, railroad president, wrote that in the summary that had no legal weight that, of course, all of the justices agree that corporations are people. The Supreme Court justice at the time specifically avoided that as a question in the case. And it was pretty clear from his writings that he didn't want that as part of it. But he died before the court recorder actually put the summary out. Yeah.
So what did he die of?
I don't know. I don't think there were suspicious circumstances there, but I don't know enough of that history to know. So the Supreme Court justice was actually basically on the side of the corporations, but he had enough integrity to say we don't need to bring that in to decide this case. Right. So he didn't expand the case to do that. The court reporter did. And this should have no precedent-setting effect whatsoever, but immediately did. So it didn't take very long before other cases used that as a precedent to say, yes, corporations are people too, just like Romney thinks. So that they started getting more and more rights. The first rights were related to the 14th Amendment, equal protection. But more and more cases came forward, and slowly, over 100 and some years since then, the Supreme Court has decided to give more and more rights. So now they've given 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 14th, and First Amendment rights to corporations.
Right.
And so they've given, these were all fabrications. It's very clear that our founders and those who were writing the 14th Amendment did not intend for corporations to have these rights.
In fact, they so distrusted corporations that they specifically put their regulation in the hands of the states on the theory that the corporation would be closer, but if the state was regulating it, the corporation would be closer to the state would have more what's the vision? Information. They would be observing more closely, and they would be regulating the behavior because they didn't trust these people.
Right. So yes, it actually worked that way for a while, but eventually corporations were able to convince some states that it would be very useful if you had us incorporate in your state. You could make money in doing so.
It was kind of the race to the bottom.
It was the race to the bottom. Very similar to what cities do sometimes nowadays with a sports stadium, for example. If we're as a franchise going to leave your city unless you build us a free multi-billion-dollar stadium, or tax advantages that are given by cities or states to corporations coming in.
I think we got this thing called Capstone that happened recently.
Yeah. Hyundai might be an example also in the city of fairly large a fairly large tax gift given to a large corporation. And so there's this and so the incorporation part from the states was kind of a race to the bottom with states saying, oh, if we make our rules more lenient, more corporations will incorporate here. And it did work that way.
Oh, yeah.
And so pretty soon all states succumbed and said, we got to make our rules as lenient as theirs.
Yeah.
And so now one of the main things that came about was perpetual life. I mean, that's 20 or 40 years seemed pretty long. You can do your public good in 20 or 40 years, but now they have perpetual life. They have limited liability. They are almost never, their charter is almost never revoked by the state. I mean, it's extremely rare. It was not that rare in early goings. And in fact, but they didn't really have to use it very much because they were limited in life anyway. So they didn't have to use it that much. There's almost never any obligation to say what public good you're going to meet when you incorporate. So many things have changed. Most of them which allow much more money to flow into the hands of corporations and those that own the corporations.
So it's back to the king. Yes. And if the king can't make money fast enough, the rules will be changed to make the king get richer faster.
It's a little different because there's quite a few more kings. Rather than one king, I don't know how many there are.
It's always been roughly a 1%. In the sense that you need, not only do you need the king, but you need the king's council and the high priests and the police and the generals.
Yeah.
And there's all these, there's this group of people, roughly 1%, that runs the system for the king. And they are given extra privileges, extra money, etc., to run it. And essentially we're looking at that today.
Yeah.
Same system.
And our country
people.
actually, just a little extent, went away from that for a while. I mean, there have been many movements and resulting Supreme Court decisions and resulting amendments, mostly amendments and laws that have given more and more power to more and more say to more and more people. I mean, even though our founders spouted all these great words, very few people could actually vote. You had to be a white male property owner, but eventually you didn't have to be a property owner, and eventually you didn't even have to be white, and way long time later you didn't even have to be male, and so there was more and more enfranchisement, and even 18-year-olds got the vote. So there's been a sort of a history of moving towards more and more enfranchisement, more and more people allowed to vote. Now, every time that happened,
there's a backlash.
There was a backlash, and now we certainly have some states working very hard to make sure that not as many people will vote as might otherwise by voter ID sorts of laws. There's a large attempt in this country to kind of work against that. But because of that greater and greater enfranchisement, there was a time when the wealthy started not having quite as high a percentage of the total wealth anymore. And it wasn't so much that they got less wealthy, it was that the middle class actually got wealthier. They participated in it, and the whole economy was doing pretty well. And
so that's the 50s.
Yeah, the 50s, even the 60s. The end of the late 40s, the 50s, even into the 60s.
Well, let's go back and look at the history that led up to the 60s. Okay, we start out in, I guess 1913 was a bumper year. That's when the Fed got set up, which said, okay, we're going to have a central bank, which means that now instead of spending money into existence, which is what we had been doing at that time, so there's no public debt. The economy is expanding. We'll just put some more money in there, and we will spend it. We will buy things for infrastructure. We'll build roads. We'll build telegraphs. We'll build, whatever, to spend that money into existence. And that system worked pretty well, but it didn't make the rich people richer. And so they didn't like that, and eventually they convinced people to accept the Fed, which is a private central bank, which now, when money gets put into existence, it's put in as it's borrowed into existence, which means we have to pay interest on it. So the same money is created out of thin air, just like it was before the Fed. Now it's still created out of thin air, but we're paying the Fed and the banks that work with the Fed interest to use the money that was created out of thin air. Now, that was a huge thing, and basically the rich people cut a deal with Wilson, the incoming Wilson administration, to say, hey guys, you've got a war coming up, so maybe you don't want to interfere with this. And so Wilson actually wrote after the end of his presidency that this was the worst decision he had ever made. But the other thing that happened then was the so-called ratification of the 16th Amendment, the income tax. And so from there, now the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, which was put into existence during the Civil War, when the income tax that paid for the Civil War was declared unconstitutional, the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue never disbanded. So they were already in position, and as soon as Philander Knox, on I believe it was February 25th, announced that the 16th Amendment had been ratified, even though it hadn't, no one challenged it. The incoming administration, the outgoing Taft administration, of course, was pro-business and had been pushing for this, and the incoming Wilson administration didn't challenge it. And so then it sort of stood for a while, and since it never got challenged, it stayed in place. But initially we had a flat tax, which essentially sucked the money out of the working class, which helped precipitate the Great Depression, which occurred because rich people had all the money, poor people or working people couldn't buy anything, and so demand collapses, and suddenly we find ourselves in this downward spiral. There's less demand, there's less orders, factories close, they lay off more workers, which means less demand, and the whole thing cycles down into the Great Depression. But the net result was a graduated income tax that had a 95% top bracket.
I think it was 92%, but it was substantial, yeah. I think it varied over the years anywhere between, I think, 80-some% to about 92%.
But during the Great Depression, there were several billionaires.
Yes.
I think somewhere, if I remember right, in the 20s, total number of billionaires. And that's when $1 billion was actually worth something. But by the end of the 1950s, there were no more billionaires in the United States. They had all disappeared. And the middle class, and there was a growing middle class, because working people actually participated in the benefits of that economic expansion.
So part of what happened was Roosevelt was often considered a traitor to his class, but he's also often considered by people who look more carefully at it as a savior of his class, because there was a growing socialist and communist movement in this country, and in order to make sure that they didn't gain too much power, Roosevelt was willing to say they should be able to participate a little bit in this economy also.
So we'll throttle back the greed for a little while, and then things will be okay.
And I think he actually had more positive notions than just that. But that's certainly part of it, was throttling back the greed so we could survive. But I think he also genuinely thought that it was useful to allow more people to participate. So we had a hugely progressive income tax, like you said, up to 90%. And not only did that bring in revenue from the 1%, but it also made it so there was not much reason to have ridiculously high salaries. So why should a company all of a sudden decide to pay its CEO 10 times as much when 90% of that was going to go to the government?
But in that period of time, that's where you and I grew up.
Yeah.
And in my family, I don't know about yours, but in my family, one paycheck was enough to own a house, eat decently, take a vacation, do all that kind of stuff. And you could, if you were reasonably frugal, one paycheck made it.
Yes, one paycheck could often do it. And the government was, we had the GI Bill, so the government was helping many people who had served their country come back and go to school. Education soared. We had a lot more people becoming educated. The nation actually did very well. Our GDP grew faster during that time than it has any time since or before that. Things were going pretty well. Eventually, there's a couple things that happened. One of them is that we helped Japan and Germany enough that they kind of recovered by the 70s. They were doing pretty well by the 70s, especially in manufacturing. And a lot of people think that it was Nixon's choice to say, boy, how are we going to come back and do better again? And he decided, probably not by manufacturing, let's just go to finance. That was a part of why things changed so much. There was a push by the federal government to say, we don't really need manufacturing so much, let's just go to finance, and we can just make money that way.
I mean, at some level it was kind of planned in that manner, but I think to a large degree it was responded to.
Yes.
In the sense that following World War II, I mean, we had bombed both Japan and Germany back to the Stone Age, you know, in terms of their industry. And so what occurred was, while we had an expansion going, we also, our businesses took the money that they had from that and reinvested it in Japan and reinvested it in Germany, making better quality steel plants, making better quality automobile plants, better quality a bunch of other things. So in other words, it was the people making money off of the economy in the United States who invested that money in creating competition for American workers.
Yeah, and certainly that has expanded tremendously. So international corporations, even though they're incorporated perhaps and have their headquarters in the United States, don't really have allegiance to the United States economy anymore. I mean, it sort of started back then to some extent, but it's grown exponentially so that they have almost no connection whatsoever to our economy. It matters almost not at all to them whether the U.S. does well, or it's Europe that does well, or it's China that does well now. I mean, China has only come into it recently, but so it doesn't matter much to them how the people in a country are doing. They can make money pretty much anywhere in the world, and so they have no vested economic interest in one country doing well, and so they're completely divorced from having policies in our country that would help people in general.
It was. I went to a program several years back, and it was stated in the program, and I never really bothered to check it because it made perfect sense. But the speaker said that 85% of the world's capital had been moved into China. Now, if you take 85% of the available investment capital, drop it into China, it's not surprising that China is growing at 10% or greater per year, every year. I mean, it's just a staggering amount of investment that's being made there, all by rich people taking the wealth that they're making in the United States, Germany, and Japan, and putting it into China. And so, of course, China is now going to have the most modern facilities for manufacture. Clean rooms, semiconductor foundries, steel work, everything. All of their stuff is the most recent, up-to-date, technologically sophisticated. It's the advanced stuff. And they have deindustrialized these other countries. And we're seeing the same deindustrialization in Germany. We're seeing it in Japan.
The United States actually, I think, still has the most value in their total industrial output, but not by very much. It's, I mean, we used to lead by a lot more. So we still, you know, there's still quite a bit here, and there's still lots of people making huge amounts of money in the U.S.
But in terms of workers, not so much.
Not so much, right.
Because the workers have been automated out of existence.
Right.
You go to an automobile manufacturing facility, and there's very few people there. You go to a lot of, you know, manufacturing facilities in the United States or other countries, and there's very few people.
Right. So it doesn't take very many people to run these plants anymore, which leads to very high worker productivity, but almost no worker benefit.
Precisely.
And because of this, some people get huge amounts of money. And in order to perpetuate their ability to get these huge amounts of money, they make sure that those who are elected to office put in programs that benefit them. And so they have vast amounts of money to put into the electoral system. And if you have no limitations, which is essentially what Citizens United did, they can completely control the narrative. So they control it during the election time. Companies themselves put a lot of money into lobbying. And so they not only did they elect the people they wanted, now they talk to them all the time.
Yep.
And nobody else can.
But one of the things that people have just looked at, there's of course Mitt Romney, and the article in, was it Vanity Fair? I don't think it's the current issue, I think it's the previous issue, where they talk about the process of how Mitt has hidden his millions, in terms of overseas shell companies and numbered accounts and tax havens and all the rest of it. It's an amazing article, and I highly recommend that people read this. It just details the system. But then more recently there was a study that was done, and I'm trying to think of who the authors were, that put somewhere between 21 and $32 billion of assets have been moved out of the actually worldwide, have been moved out of the countries where they belong and are now in these tax havens for the wealthy, which represents somewhere on the order of 10% of the total value of assets in place on the planet.
So it's got to be in the trillions then, yeah.
Yeah,
it's a 30 trillion.
Did I say billion?
Yeah,
sorry,
okay.
I meant trillion.
Yeah.
So somewhere between 21 and $32 trillion has been identified, okay, in these offshore tax havens, the Cayman Islands, Swiss bank accounts, all that kind of stuff. And where, that's essentially where Mitt's put his money so that he can avoid taxes. So we ought to be calling for Mitt to, submit his tax returns.
And certainly there's a lot of people calling for that, but even if he does, there will probably be a way that with enough money they can spin that to his advantage. So I'm guessing that that's not going to end up being a big enough issue to do much. Well, now, the other part of the problem, of course, is that although I certainly think Obama is much better than Mitt, he's very much a corporatist also. Oh, yeah. And so we need to work hard to push from below to get to change things, no matter who's elected, because that's only a very, very small part of the process.
Let's talk about that for a second. I mean, there is this enormous broad spectrum of political thought, okay? From, I guess from, as the viewers are seeing it, from the right, okay? Is that the right? Okay, yeah, that's the right. From the right to the left, we're reversed, okay? But what's really happening is our government is only representing this small, narrow part of the political spectrum, which is largely very right, very pro-corporate, and just ignoring what people see in both ends of that spectrum.
Especially the left end. There is to me, very close to that right end. So there's not all that much they're ignoring over there, but certainly towards the left end, there's a huge amount there that is being ignored by national political system. If we think about voting and the ballot, what can we do? Which this is a ballot measure, so there's a lot of things that people in Oregon will vote on that have nothing to do with the candidates. There's ballot measures, and there's a lot of good ballot measures out there, and so even if people have no candidate whatsoever they like, they should definitely vote. Yeah. Because to have your opinion registered on these ballot measures is significant. Yeah. I mean, you're only a small part of it, but it's significant if enough people do that. So even for those who have not a single candidate they can like, they should vote on it. There's also candidates from minor parties in Oregon running for many different things. It's a much more useful thing to vote that way than it is to not vote.
Yeah, but let's go back to this Obama, versus Mitt. I mean, they're not very far apart in that little section right there. Or take Al Gore. I mean, one of the things was Al Gore sort of got demonized because he did that documentary on climate change.
Right.
But Al is a corporatist. He believes that, climate change is a real serious problem. And again, there's a recent study that came out. They redid all the temperature data and basically found, oh yeah, they did it right originally. But the thing is that Al's solution is to use the marketplace. In other words, we'll just tweak the incentives a little bit here and there, and it'll be able to take care of the problem. And the bottom line is, no, it can't take care of the problem because the marketplace created the problem.
Yeah. the marketplace created the problem, but just acknowledging that there is a problem is a substantial thing. And there are some small things that can be done from a corporate perspective that could be helpful. Again, we need to push away from that and try to get better things being done without the corporate perspective, but it's much better to have somebody who is willing to at least acknowledge the problem than somebody who wants to deny it. So even though from a reasonable perspective, Mitt and Obama are extremely close on a lot of things, they're really very far apart.
But you know, in the I guess the climate change conference that just occurred, I mean, Obama had to fly in at the end to try to, you know, calm things down a little bit. But the thing is that they left with a meaningless agreement or no agreement at all.
Right.
So essentially, you know, here we are, years and years and years into the process, and nothing will be done, nor is it likely to be done.
Yes. So one of the ways that I can see in the long run a way out of this is a constitutional amendment. Now, of course, the constitutional amendment has to be passed by the Congress, and so to get one that will do what needs to be done is not going to happen unless there's a huge movement forcing them to do so.
Exactly.
So that is a major goal. We feel that this advisory question is part of the way to begin building a movement that will do this. So it's not so important that we pass this advisory question. I mean, it is important that we say yes on it, but the more important thing is that people start thinking about this and say, oh, we got to become part of a movement to do this, because nothing good is going to happen unless we force Congress to do good things.
So let's go back to how are we going to get people to vote yes on this question? That's the trick.
Well, the initial polling about Citizens United would suggest that most people would. Every place that it's such a question has come up, it's won by somewhere in the neighborhood of 75% or more. We don't think Eugene is all that conservative that will go against that. The Register Guard, even though it says, oh, Citizens United was a horrible decision, but it's so dangerous to do a constitutional amendment, we shouldn't do something like this. So that to me is going to be our biggest hurdle, that we're going to have to convince people it's much more dangerous to not do it than it is to do it. There's reasons to be worried about it. There's certainly wording in constitutional amendments that have been proposed that is not very good, and we need to be careful about what actually gets out. We need to be careful that certain things are included in the amendment. I mean, the notion that corporations should have rights, to me, it's pretty clear, and I don't think it's very dangerous to say they shouldn't, unless there's particular rights you think they should have, and those could be enumerated in an amendment. If there is some right that people think, oh, that corporation should have because when they're incorporated in this state, we don't want another state interfering with them, or we don't want the feds interfering with that particular right. If they really think that, you could enumerate it.
Let's look at the question of the right to free speech. Okay, human beings have, you know, First Amendment says abridging the right of free speech. Okay, and that means that you basically have the right to lie. Okay, you have the right to make stupid statements. There's information, there's misinformation, and there's disinformation. Okay, information is good. Misinformation is where you think it's good, but it's really wrong, and disinformation is where you know it's wrong. Okay, but you're putting it out there to convince people for some economic benefit. Now, if corporations do not have First Amendment rights, which means they do not have the right to lie, then we can call them on that stuff.
Yes.
Okay, but if they have the right to lie, then we can't challenge the advertising when they're lying to us.
Yeah, and in general, the courts have kind of said that in certain sorts of advertising, they can't really lie. You know, if you're trying to sell a product and you really just completely flat out lie about it,
Yeah.
You can be challenged on it. But they've also said, and this is true for people too, if it's about politics, of course you can lie.
Yeah.
Because it's just an opinion. So they actually don't have complete freedom to lie all the time, but for politics they do.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing you got to keep in mind is they're spending not the people making the decision to do these political ads
Right.
are not spending their money; they're spending the stockholders' money, and the stockholders have never agreed to do this. That's not why they invested their money in there. I mean, a lot of the stockholders, much of the stock is owned by pension funds. The pension funds of the PERS system did not agree to the politics of the companies that, all of the companies that are putting money into the system. And so they're also using money that's not theirs to do these lies. And that right there is wrong. But they also just have way too much money. They can completely pervert the system. So the court actually has recognized that vast quantities of money can corrupt the system, and therefore for candidates themselves, it can be limited.
Well, it's not just can corrupt the system.
Would have,
I mean, it has clearly actually done it.
Right, and certainly in Montana, they have a long history. It clearly happened.
Yep.
It was terribly corrupted. The people got together and said, corporations can no longer participate in our electoral system.
Right.
And that law existed for 100 years. Citizens United basically overturned it. The Montana Supreme Court said, no, because you said if there's an obvious corruption in the system, the state has a right to do this. And that was brought to the Supreme Court again, and the Supreme Court said, oh, but that's not a good enough reason now. Or maybe the real, I don't know exactly what they basically didn't even give a reason. They just said, forget it. We believe what we said the last time, that it should be totally unlimited.
So in other words, as we sit here, we're trying to recover from the fact that the Supreme Court has said that corporate America can buy the remaining pieces of the government that it doesn't already own.
Yes.
And in order to start saying that that's a problem, we should be looking at this question and getting this to pass big time.
Yes.
On this ballot, and present that as one more of many, many reasons collected from around the country to say, excuse me, there's a problem here and maybe we should rethink this thing.
Yeah.
Corporate rights.
Right.
So are you know, I guess the question, so we're almost down to the end. Got a couple of seconds. Any closing remarks?
Well, I hope that people vote yes, and if it's the only thing they vote on the ballot, do so and vote yes.
Yeah. So if nothing else, pick up your ballot for this reason. So I thank you for tuning in, and we will see you guys on the next episode of Occupy TV.
Great.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that
how'd that go?
sound? Everybody look
went
what's
pretty well.
going down.
Enough useful information out to people.
Well, you know.